Proprius is a more environmentally responsible choice. When deciding how to leave this world, we have two primary choices. We can choose to either be buried or to be cremated. Both choices have an impact on the community that we leave behind. However, to fully understand the impact of our individual decisions, we need to place them within the context of the bigger picture, to see how the total of all of our choices impact our community as a whole. To accomplish this, let's focus our perspective on these 7 counties in northern Utah, of which in 2008 there were over 10,000 of us who died. However, because our population is increasing and the baby boomer generation, there will be more of us die in the next 20 years than ever before. It is projected that by 2015, the number of us dying each year will increase to over 11,000, by 2020 to over 13,000, and by 2030, over 16,000 of us will pass away each year, which means in total, there will be 54,000 of us die in the next 5 years, over 116,000 in the next 10 years, and in the next 20 years, over 264,000 of us will pass away. Now let's use these numbers to illustrate the impact of our individual choice on our community as a whole. Now, of course, we don't know how many of us will choose to be buried or to be cremated, but in 2008, 79% of us chose burial and 21% of us chose to be cremated. So for the sake of illustration, let's carry these projections forward. With burial, much of the environmental impact comes from how we decide to be buried. And there are many choices, ranging from a simple shroud made of fabric, to a simple wooden or woven casket, to a more elaborate wooden or metal casket. In the United States, every year over 1.8 million caskets are sold and produced using lots of valuable resources, like metal. It's estimated that we use over 180 million pounds of steel, which is enough to build a new Golden Gate Bridge every year, and 5.4 million pounds of copper and bronze. And these metals can be sourced from strip mining. We also use an estimated 30 million board feet of hardwood that can come from tropical regions like South America, and using harvesting techniques like clear cutting. Often, these resources can come from all over the globe, travel thousands of miles to places like Asia, where they are processed, to then travel thousands of miles to the United States, where they are manufactured into caskets using glues, binders, stains, and varnishes, all toxic chemicals, to then travel thousands of miles to reach our northern Utah community. In comparison, Proprius provides simple wooden caskets that are produced using local timber from the Uinta Mountains, which is marked by the U.S. Forest Service and then selectively harvested, transported short distances to be processed into lumber at a local mill, travels 6 miles to Proprius, where it's manufactured into caskets using no metal or harsh chemicals, to travel a maximum of 60 miles to reach the entire northern Utah community. So what we choose to be buried in has a big impact on the environment. However, so does what we are buried with. And one of the biggest environmental concerns is embalming. Embalming is a process where the human body is drained of fluids and replaced with up to 3 gallons of embalming fluid. And embalming fluid can be a combination of several different chemicals, many of which are toxic, and the number one modern chemical is formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen. It's important to note that embalming is not required. In fact, embalming is only really popular in the United States. Around the world, there are over 62 million deaths annually, and few choose to be embalmed with little to no impact on public safety. And even in the United States, embalming is not required by law, And there are alternatives, like using refrigeration, or recently there are less toxic forms of embalming fluid that are formaldehyde-free, like the new Millennium line from an innovative company called Champion. To illustrate the potential negative impacts of burial on our community, let's create a worst-case scenario where all of us that will die in the future and the 80% of us that choose burial all choose to be buried in a globally manufactured casket that is produced with toxic chemicals and an average of 100 pounds of metal. Additionally, we all choose to be embalmed with 3 gallons of embalming fluid in any one of the 82 cemeteries scattered across northern Utah. It's also interesting to note that if we look at a map from the state of Utah of our water resources, specifically the basin fill aquifers, which are one of our primary sources of groundwater, and overlay that with a map of our cemeteries of northern Utah, we can clearly see that the majority of our cemeteries sit directly over one of our major sources of groundwater. Moving forward in our example, by 2015, if 43,000 of us are buried, it will mean over 4.3 million pounds of metal and 129,000 gallons of toxic chemicals will be buried into our soil directly over our groundwater. By 2020, it will be over 9.1 million pounds of metal and 275,000 gallons of chemicals. And in the next 20 years, it will mean almost 21 million pounds of metal and 625,000 gallons of toxic poisons. This example clearly shows that what we are buried in and with can have a major negative impact on our northern Utah community. At first glance, cremation can seem to be a very environmentally friendly option. However, cremation also has significant environmental impacts. First, cremation requires high amounts of energy. Cremating a human body requires temperatures of anywhere from 1400 to 2100 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 to 5 hours. It's estimated that cremation is the energy equivalent of making a 4,800-mile road trip. Secondly, cremation can be a source of highly toxic pollution because when we're cremated, what's inside of our bodies and what we are cremated with is vaporized into the air of our community. One of the major concerns is mercury, much of which comes from mercury amalgam fillings. And according to the American Dental Association, 70% of us born prior to 1990 have some mercury amalgam fillings. And when we're cremated, this is vaporizing a highly toxic metal directly into the air of our community. So, when choosing cremation, we can also choose to have our mercury fillings removed first. Embalming is also a major concern because when we choose to be embalmed before we are cremated, now the formaldehyde and other toxic chemicals are vaporized into the air of our community. Continuing in our potential negative environmental impact scenario, we could assume that the remaining 21% of us that are cremated also choose to be embalmed with 3 gallons of embalming fluid prior to being cremated at any one of the 11 crematoriums scattered across our northern Utah community. This would mean that in addition to the pollution of our soil and water from those of us choosing burial, that over the next 5 years, 11,000 of us would be cremated, vaporizing over 33,000 gallons of toxic poisons and any mercury in our bodies into the air of our environment. Over the next 10 years, it would be 72,000 gallons, and in the next 20 years, 165,000 gallons of toxic chemicals vaporized into our community's environment. Whether we choose cremation or burial, it has an environmental impact on our northern Utah community. Proprius provides caskets that require less energy and add less toxic chemicals to our community. An environmentally responsible choice, because no matter how we choose to leave this world, it has a big impact on the world that we leave behind.